The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and do not reflect the opinions of JSOU, USSOCOM, and the Department of Defense.
Welcome to the next episode of the JSOU Soft Design and Innovation podcast series. And what we're addressing today with our group here is the role of the strategic sponsor, the change agent, if you will, of a military or defense organization, and how both we as the members of the organization that are attempting to facilitate design may interact with that sponsor, what the role is of that sponsor in addressing both the designers, but also the rest of the organization, and how we might work on messaging, how we may work on the environment to include the classroom, the office space, the operations orders, the language, as well as some of the more abstract concepts, and what it means to request innovation in your organization, and how might one lead that organization. Introducing myself, I'm Ben Zweibelson, the program director here for the Joint Special Operations University's Soft Design and Innovation family of programs, and representing in a contractor role the program. So joining me to my left, that you can't see, Miss Laura Stenger.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me join the group. Laura Stenger, faculty here at the Joint Special Ops University. Primary role here is to facilitate the Joint Soft Pre-Command course. So dabbling, introducing a little bit of a design into the 05-06 command team leadership experience.
Excellent.
Yeah, my name is Mathew McHale, formerly the director of J3 International, just gave that job up here at USSOCOM. And so really my experience with design was to help, advance the J3 International. How do we go make that a better, more collaborative space?
Hi, I'm Nate Schwagler, course director here at JSOU, teaching in the Design and Innovation program, as well as the Creative Problem Solving course.
And I'm Paul Mitchell. I'm the Director of Academics at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto, Ontario. We've been experimenting with design on both the War College and Command and Staff level of our programs for about 10 years now. Yeah, good to be here, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. So let's start this off with talking about change agents, which is a popular term these days. But what do we really mean by that? When a leader at, say, the operational or strategic level of an organization is requesting, things aren't working right now the way they used to. And we're really good at doing certain things that used to work. But now that we're doing them and they're not working, how do we do something different? How do we break out of that frame? So change agents are requesting and asking of their organization to innovate, to adapt, to change out of what they're doing and break some of those patterns. So how does a strategic sponsor, if you will, someone who wants to usher in this change, how do they do that? So any thoughts? Who would like to venture their thoughts on this first?
I think it's, this is Matthew. So I think it's interesting if you do have that senior level that says, this isn't working, therefore I am looking for different. In my experience, it's that they don't know what they want. It's that frustration with, you're not giving it to me kind of thing. There needs to be something more. And so the change agent, in my experience, has been sort of that middle management, that frustration of something else. And it really, in my couple of instances, it starts in the middle, and then you have to go up and find that, sort of convince that sponsor. Mm-hmm. There's a tipping point where you are going to change a facility or change an organization or do something drastically different, that you need to either have money or organizational change or something that has to be effective. But that idea that innovation, I think, comes, in my experience, comes a lot from that middle. And then you have to convince that change agent up higher.
That really reflects, this is Paul from CFC again, that really reflects our experience up north at the college when we began to introduce design into the programs. As I put it, we just sort of stumbled onto the concept. We didn't really know much about design. We saw some articles on in Military Review, and it really scratched the itch, which was all about, why aren't things working the way that they have been in the past? Why are our actions not generating the kinds of effects that we've been expecting based on our history and past operations? And we played around with the idea for a number of years before anybody really noticed that we were doing so. And in that time, it was, I think, really important because, Ben, you were saying about, the fact that people don't know what they want. And I was thinking of Henry Ford, and I'll tell them what they want. And that was kind of where we're in a process of invention, really, in many ways. And because of that, the way that I put it is we had to grow the sponsors. You had to change, the metaphor I like is an ecosystem where
Yes.
you have to create new creatures or new organisms within that ecosystem that recognize the value and can exploit the value of a creative approach or an innovative approach to doing your business.
Right. So this is Laura, I'm going to jump in on that. So the concept of growing the change agent. So in our course, we do this silly task, right? To have them communicate their command philosophy in a picture. And you can imagine, a bunch of hardened warriors being asked to draw a picture about their command philosophy on the first day of class. And, we go through the exercise, they give the assignment. And on the Friday, when we're sort of back briefing it all out, I tell them it was never about the picture. It was about your thinking about the picture and what that thinking led to other ideas about your philosophy and how you would approach your command. So on the Monday, you can see the frustration of like, why am I being asked to do this? And then on the Friday, you see the aha moment of like, oh, I see what this did for me. And so it was communicating to them, you now as a leader of the organization have the power to create the environment to allow your people to think divergently, to do things differently, to get you the results that you are looking for.
That's a really, I'm sorry, Paul again, that really is evocative. I remember in Umberto Eco's famous book, The Name of the Rose, and he talks about at one point about how you use theories. Theories like a ladder. It allows you to get to a particular place, but then you have to discard the ladder to get, once you've reached it, because you no longer need that ladder. You now have the ability to think on your own without that tool that helped you get there. And I think that's interesting in the sense that in the context of the question about a change sponsor, that, we're leading them in a particular direction and they have to become self-aware about what it is that they need. That's a difficult space for people to approach.
Two interesting, I think, if divergent aspects of this. One, you've got, I think, Ben, when you set up the challenge, you had us thinking about leader-driven sponsorship of a problem set or tasking a group of designers to go look at something differently and bring back some fresh perspectives, right? Organizationally, what's served us in the past, we're no longer getting the effects or the outcomes that we need. But we've got these legacy processes in place, and those have a certain gravity to them inside the organization. So it's stopping us from being able to do things differently in a way that might produce some novel outcomes. And then Colonel Matt chimed in and said, well, wait a minute, there might also be this opportunity for change to be inspired by the middle, right? Middle management driven change. So it's not necessarily a leader tasking a subordinate unit to do design, but instead, I think there are two unique aspects of the middle management inspired design approach. In that middle management, their proximity to the problem sets is likely really, really close. Got this great familiarity, they're kind of living it, and that they're really close to the problems versus a senior leader who might be, somebody else is managing his or her calendar. It's been a while since they've touched those problems, probably, right? And then the second thing that I think about is that senior leader likely has a different risk profile relative to a manager or somebody who's has an interest in innovation because it might help him or her get promoted, right? Once you hit the top, you're trying to de-risk your activities because the upside for you is limited at that point. You already hit the pinnacle, right? At least, then this is likely, I'm drawing these examples from the civilian business world where things are a little bit differently. You become the CEO, now you're accountable to Wall Street, and the last thing you want to do is introduce a bunch of new risk into your enterprise. But I'd be curious to the team, your thoughts on what that concept might look like in a military or security environment.
So this has been, and what you just said earlier, the desire of promotion. That's something that's unavoidable. It's part of the military centralized hierarchy, and it's our modernist style manufactured year groups and promotion structures. But it reminds me of out of the Dr. Mitchell's Stumbling into Design article from the Journal of Military Strategic Studies. He talks about a revolt that happened with a cohort of War College students a few years ago, where they absolutely rejected the playfulness of the design environment. They thought it was silly, pointless, it wasn't serious, and they outright mutinied and said, we are not doing any more of this military design. We are going to just do some regular joint planning process. And one of the findings that Dr. Mitchell wrote about, if I remember correctly, was you said, part of that allure of being close enough to that next level, in this case for them, general officer for some, might actually stymie the risk of trying to experiment versus Matt's comments earlier, and Nate, you echoed it again. Middle management at the field grade level, there is some room to explore and take risk before you get into those critical areas where step the wrong way and you're going home.
Absolutely. The kernels of that period of time were, on the edge of greatness. They're about to be promoted to flag rank. They're in a very vulnerable part of their career where one mistake and you're not going to get that star. You're not going to go on. You're going to be finished in terms of your career. And so it's a really, really risky venture to adopt a different course of action or a different approach to doing business.
I think that's interesting, Laura. You were talking about pre-command course folks that are still on that edge about promotion. Speaking as a terminal 06 with no more potential, getting ready to retire, there's a liberation that comes with that when you recognize that, hey, this is your lot in life. You were off that command track. You stop looking at for errors and what's going to take me off, what's the right thing to do, and you just do what is right. So there's an empowerment. So perhaps as you build your team, to fuel it with those kind of people who are a little bit more fearless. And the role of the sponsor, though, if you look at your commanders, if you can say to them and convince them just this ability to challenge those folks to think differently and give them that protection, that freedom, that space to make the mistakes. And sir, you alluded to that in your talk, be able to fall down a little bit. And when you weren't being observed, it's easy to fall down and make mistakes because you're not highlighted. But once people start looking at you, then there's kind of a higher cost. So that sponsorship really gives you that freedom and that courage that comes.
I think, though, that all of that is true, and I agree with everything. But I can also see the averse of that argument as well. Somebody who is bulletproof, because I'm at the end of my career, I'm not going anywhere, I can do whatever I want, I'm going to pursue my hobby horse, I'm going to grind the axes that I have, can be very destructive in terms of team building and create toxic environments as well. So there's a bit of a balance in there that one has to be careful in terms of how liberated do you want people to be. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to produce people who are capable of working with the system and leading the system, not just tearing down things around it and leaving a stinking mess in the rubble.
So this illustrates a nice tension that we brought up thus far for design consideration, in that there are change agents, and some of those change agents become strategic sponsors. They're at that high level of the organization that they can steer the ship. There are other change agents that may be empowered by the strategic sponsor, but they're operating somewhere else in the organization. There's two examples that we use in our courses that come from the interwar period, the 1920s. One of them is a French example, and this is more of that strategic sponsor. The general officer was watching a demonstration of mechanized artillery, which was at that point very new. And at the end of the demonstration, he was very impressed with what they did, and they fired the system very quickly. But he walked up to the captain and asked, what are these two men doing here that were standing at attention behind the system? And the French captain said, they're there to hold the horses. But you don't have any horses anymore. They're gone. And so it took that leader, that strategic sponsor, to kind of shock the organization and say, look, we have to change here. We are holding invisible horses. We need to stop this. And that's an example of where the leader is able to have the vision to institute that change. But the other example that I think we're hitting on here, the middle management one, there's another example from the British Royal Air Force in the same period. And unlike the British infantry, which traditionally at that point was still very much grounded in almost a pre-modern aristocratic approach to gentlemen ride horses, shoot well, and they know their drill and ceremony, and that's all they need. And if you are reading books, you're trying too hard. However, the Royal Air Force Aviation were doing the exact opposite. And they actually would take, out of all the airplanes they would receive from the engineer, they would take one airplane and they'd strip all the instructions and all the information was removed from it. And they would tell their pilots to get in that airplane and fly it and break all the rules, because they wanted to see if somebody could tease out a new capability that even the engineers that created the plane didn't really know, and that they could use it against their enemy. And so the expectation there is the change agents are being fostered at the mid to lower level. And the leader there, the strategic sponsor, is just creating the context for the design to happen, not knowing what may happen and increasing a tremendous risk that there might be a fiery wreck.
What's something that, or you think the strategic sponsor can be doing to reduce friction in a design endeavor?
So we have a colleague in Israel, Ofra Gracer, who is very influential on all of our thinking in the design community. And the one thing that I've learned from Ofra is she says the general is the disruptor of his own system. The system has lots of control features in it, and that's what it's there to do. It's to control the work of the organization. But when the general wants it to do something different, the general has to disrupt that system in a particular way. And so again, you talk about friction, and probably the thing that creates the most friction are the ways we do business. This is the way we've always done things. This is the way we understand it. This is right conduct and this is wrong conduct. This is what we define as professional and this is what we define as unprofessional. And all of those things are mental friction that limit our ability to think beyond the boxes that we all exist in. And so for a general, again, in an environment of trust, to say, I want you to step outside of those boxes. No, we're not going to do things the way we've always done it. We're going to do it differently. And this is because I want to achieve these particular things. I think that is something that really is that removes those organizational constraints that self-limit everybody's ability to really to think deeply and broadly about what it is they're confronting, and to confront, the inevitable 900-pound gorilla that, I'm sorry, General, you are the biggest source of friction in the organization, and we need to have a serious conversation about that. Radical thought, I know, but
Laura, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, trust is big. If I can have a leader that will just trust me, given my clear left and right boundaries, legal, moral, and ethical, that I can operate within that space. That's all I can ask.
Is it a challenge, though, if when we ask a leader, and when we use this, Harold Nelson was cited in The Design Way, and also before that in 1992, Buchanan wrote very similar things. The organization needing that which it needs but does not yet exist is a nice way of kind of talking a little bit about design and this emergence. So if a leader needs something and it doesn't yet exist, what happens if they're not ready when the design team brings it to them? Sort of like Ray Kroc when he walks up to the first McDonald's, and even he, who becomes the founder of the franchise, can't handle McDonald's.
That's where I think baby steps comes in.
Yeah.
However slight the change, the tiny littlest step.
We talked about
Is how you-
sorry, go ahead.
No, Matthew, I just, picking up then on the why, and Nate, that you said. So the why gives you so much, because when you go back to the boss, and as you pointed out, here's the idea, you get that initial no. It's the why that probably ended up convincing. Why did they go back and they repitch their idea? If this is what the boss is asking for, you connect him to that. It also empowers that, back to the middle management discussion, right? So as you run into that friction, as you said, sir, and along the way, well, those are good identifications of those limits, those boxes, those things. And then, even if the boss says, hey, it will be so, you will knock down this barrier, you have to take that why to that resistant force eventually to kind of, so the why becomes really important for me, and then the trust is obviously going to be there, but, to make that decision.
But I think there's this, Paul, again, I think there's something that we absolutely have to acknowledge here is that when we're talking about innovation and creativity, we're talking about things that have no track record, that they're unique. There's no history against which you can evaluate. And so risk and vulnerability are central to creativity. To be truly creative is to take risk. You are the beginning of a new art movement. When Picasso, started putting out his work, or the Impressionists or Van Gogh, all these artists that came up with entirely new way of visual expression. And, as we all know, Van Gogh was never sold a painting and was frustrated his entire life. And yet now he is like one of the most influential, sources of inspiration, for a whole series of historical works or what have you. There is always going to be risk and vulnerability in the introduction of the new, because we don't know what it's going to lead to next, and whether it's going to be a valuable innovation or whether it's going to be something that will undermine the certainties of everything that we hold dear institutionally or professionally. And that is something that is just inherent in the nature of the enterprise. So I think there's a lot of times, people's resistance is because they're trying to risk manage their way through that vulnerability, through the uncertainty that is involved with innovation, rather than embracing it and recognizing, this is a risk, but this is a risk in the same way that everything in military affairs is a risk. When we launch an operation, we really can't say whether it will go correctly or not, whether it'll be a disaster like Eagle Claw was in Iran, or whether it will be an amazing success like Desert Storm. That we can't know what's going to happen next. And so it is fundamental to the military enterprise, risk and vulnerability, but we need to embrace that within the context of military design as well.
I can recall sitting down with the CEO of a big publicly traded company. We were trying to design an engagement to support her interest in developing the creative thinking capacity within her organization. And I remember asking her, I said, looking at your stock price and things are going really, really well for your organization. You're growing at a good clip. Everybody's happy. I said, why do you want to do this now? Trying to unpack her motivations for why this seems like a good idea. And basically, I agree with you. There is risk involved in investment and creative work, right? And she said, I want to make sure that we fix the roof while the sun's still shining. I thought that was a pretty enlightened perspective in terms of, we know that anytime you're taking on creative endeavors, it's probably not going to play out the way you think it's going to. During your lecture, you mentioned 90% of startups fail. And I think if you look at the ones that are successful, the ones that really pop and get like unicorn status or do really, really well from a financial perspective, I think a similar percentage of them, an overwhelming amount, end up being successful with a product or a market that they didn't start out with. So they have had to pivot to find their success. Yeah. So the biggest risk is not starting in the first place, I think. But no, just my thought.
And this has been, again, that touches upon, a good way for us to probably start closing this out. The danger of a change agent either ushering in destruction or potentially the organization destroying the change agent because their ideas were either not applied correctly or usefully, or they bucked the system, if you will. I think Billy Mitchell is a great example of this from the United States Air Force and Naval air power history, in that at the end of World War I, Billy Mitchell was planning out airborne infantry operations against the German front lines, and the war ended before he was able to do it. So he was already a generation ahead, amazingly, and then moved on in the 1920s to advocate the use of air power for the aircraft carrier as well as naval bombardment using aircraft against battleships and arguing against the entire institution that battleships were irrelevant. And that really brought on the hurt locker, if you will. Everyone went against him, and he eventually got court-martialed because he started fighting the system as well. But nonetheless, we still named an aircraft after him in World War II because he was right, and he was a visionary. And if you think about it, there's a lot of military visionaries that get discarded because they've bucked the system has rejected them. And then still they end up being right because that change had to be done by somebody. So in closing, what are some of your thoughts maybe on advice to people that are listening right now that either work for a strategic sponsor or they hope to be a strategic sponsor or they want to be a change agent? How do you do this and institute innovation without getting yourself court-martialed? Thoughts?
Yeah. So one thing I'd maybe put out there to think about would be, and this is Nate, spend at least as much time thinking about how you'll find acceptance for ideas as you do thinking up new ideas. One common approach is the stakeholder analysis framework or tool. Figure out, who can benefit, who stands to benefit from the adoption of this thing, who's going to get in the way, and what do you have to do to potentially move people who are going to be straight up dissidents or barriers or whatever to adoption, and move them at least over into a neutral capacity so they don't care, But it's exploring for acceptance. I think spending at least as much time and energy doing that as you do trying to think up new things could be something worth tucking in your back pocket.
I have to agree. I'm sorry. I'm just going to pile on. I would use the word empathy rather than stakeholder analysis, but I think we're talking the same thing. Is a deep understanding of the perspective of of who it is that you are pitching the idea to. What kind of constraints are they working under? What kind of challenges how do they understand things? And that is, like any good operation. I mean, that you're trying to convince people want to be led in the direction of things that they're comfortable with. And so an empathetic understanding of your opponent leads to great things in terms of that. So I completely agree on that. Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, final thoughts, Laura, Matt?
Yeah, so I go back to the incremental improvements. So, it's hard to accept the big change, but can your sponsor take a little change? Like, can you push that sponsor to be just a little uncomfortable, understanding the empathy, where he's coming from, to just move the system ever so slightly in the direction you want it to go?
I saw something from Adam Grant, one of my favorite researchers at Wharton, who writes a lot about creativity and organizational creativity and innovation work. Posted something on social media the other day that has me thinking, but he's talking about change management. I think the common model or the common approach is for the leader to get up and spend a lot of time and energy focused on describing and explaining and articulating the rationale for change, why it needs to happen in the first place, what's the impetus, the driver. If we don't do this, then all these bad things will happen, right? That's the narrative we get from the mouthpiece. But he was advocating, and I'm not sure what his source was, but he was advocating for a counterintuitive approach, which was another strategy for how to do this stuff well, might be to get up and say, here are all the things that are going to stay the same. And the principle behind that was to help everyone in your organization feel comfortable enough to get on board with the change, understanding that the change piece may be small relative to here are all the things that you don't have to worry about. You don't have to stress about change because these pieces will still be there tomorrow, right? Again, going back to that psychological safety piece and the trust piece, as opposed to just kind of rallying the troops and trying to inspire them to do something different,
It's interesting because you just reminded me of my own professional experience of coming to the Canadian Forces College 21 years ago. When I first showed up there, I was the only academic. There hadn't been any academic for several years at the college, and I was welcomed with all the joy of getting a cold. And the antibodies deployed themselves. What happened was because I was relegated to a corner for about a year and a half, I was able to develop that empathetic approach. But your point about incrementalism is also really important because, as I recall, initially there was zero trust to handing curriculum over to the academic because the academic was a civilian, didn't have a military background, and we're not going to hand the holiest of holies over on professionalism to somebody without our own experience. But they eventually turned a very small piece of curriculum over to me and said, we're really struggling with this. Maybe you can have an idea. And I said, well, we could do it like this. We could do it like that. Oh, that's really interesting. Let's try it. It worked. Well, would you look at this piece over here? And it grew and grew and grew. And ultimately I called it the Field of Dreams strategy, which is if you build it, they will come. You build the small thing, you demonstrate the competency, you generate the trust, you reduce the feeling that we are vulnerable to this change, and it opens up a little bit, and you take advantage of those spaces like a good special operations, operator, and exploit the gaps and seams, and eventually the space opens up sufficiently to allow the big changes to take place.
Yeah, had you shown up on day one and said, I suggest you hand over all your curriculum to the civilian academic.
Oh, that would have been a disaster.
Yeah, exactly.
Might not have been a day two.
Yeah.
I'm thinking the same way. It's showing value to those, the folks that put up the most resistance. What can you do for them? I mean, how do you, if you look at what are the ramifications of the change you're going to make, do your analysis on who's going to be most resistant, find out why. A lot of times their professional bona fides or whatever is connected to whatever that is. Hey, I'm good at doing this. Therefore, if you try to take it away from me, then that's a bad thing. So, I mean, there really is some analysis, not only on what changes to make, but then, then how do you go about that? And it might be, just incremental. And then where do you start on the whole thing? Take what's given to you, as you suggested, one little, curriculum change, or do you go, at a specific target that, you bond with or something? But I do think you have to pay it forward to turn those people a little bit.
Closing question for you, Ben. In your practice as a design professional, without naming names, but can you help us think about or tell us a story about a time where you had a design sponsor who was really extraordinary and effective in the room and supportive at challenging their team, the design teams, to really think outside the existing frames and legacy system and produce new options. And then maybe an example of here's what not to do, or here's
Sure.
a situation where it didn't go well.
Very briefly, two very vivid examples. One, the sponsor came in and gathered the forces and said, look, I do not want you to make another plan. If you make me another plan, I'm going to fire you. Or it's something to those effects. And he said, look, we've already made plans and they're not working. I want you to clear everything out. I want you to rip everything to the ground. I want you to take this organization and I want you to do everything that we can on the whiteboards to figure out a new advantage. And he gave a couple of examples that were pretty specific, but they were pretty radical. I mean, they were very controversial examples, and he just threw them out there. And everyone kind of, the dust settled and he left. And immediately after he left, two of the people that were kind of institutional shepherds of the old planning immediately stood up and said, we need to resurrect the old plans. And then I had to spend, as a design facilitator, the next 20 minutes trying to stop them and remind them by rereading to them what their sponsor had said. And what was amazing to me, and this was early on in my facilitation experience, how resolute and entrenched those beliefs are to keep and preserve the old ways of doing things, even when your sponsor is telling you to not do them. And sometimes we almost have to exercise them out. And in some cases, maybe those people just need to be removed from your design team. Maybe you have to do that. An example, maybe a negative one, would be having a leader, and I've seen this from time to time, where they say, hey, I want you to do design. This is great. I really support it. But we need to isolate the problem statement in this complex system so that we can solve it creatively. And I've heard this multiple times said, and you kind of look at it and you're like, none of those words work together. They are all entirely incompatible. Like, we don't solve complex challenges, and we don't have end states in complex systems, and don't really isolate these things. So then when you see that, then the warning flags go up as, all right, how do we approach the sponsor where they might not be tied into some of the design nuances with the academia or the theory or even the language, but nonetheless, those leaders still want change, and they still realize that things aren't going well. But even then, the language and the structures and the processes that they have are insufficient in them articulating even to themselves what they really want, which goes back to that example of either you go from McDonald's and Ray Kroc struggling at the drive-in. What do you mean this is my hamburger? I just ordered it. Or having the G.I. Joe example at Hasbro, where he goes, no, go back, come back in 2 weeks.
If I remember correctly, he says, you're not there yet.
Yeah.
Magic word being yet.
Yeah.
Right. He creates the space for them to go back and I think that's what created the space for them to come back with that partnership opportunity with, was it DC?
It was Marvel.
Marvel?
Yeah.
Yeah. So their co-branding and their go-to-market strategy then had this other strategic partner involved, which represented access to a marketplace and an established, really de-risking the new introduction of that product into the system. So follow-up question for you would be, Ben, is it incumbent then upon the facilitator, the design facilitator, to engage with the strategic sponsor ahead of time so you don't walk into a situation where the commander then comes in, offers the strategic guidance that isn't aligned with the essence of design or sort of the intention of design? Is there a pre-brief that needs to happen with the sponsor to make sure you're aligned in terms of how you're communicating the challenge and the tasking to the design teams?
Absolutely. And so this is one of the issues that military design wrestles with, I think. And that's that we're on the go and we want to do design right away. And you're only brought in on Monday and you're told to start design Monday. And the reality is that if you look at civilian design professionals and design methodologies in the commercial world, there's an enormous amount of research and there's an enormous amount of interaction with design teams and the client, if you will, or the topic of interest, sometimes months before the actual design happens. And there's a reason for that. The empathy or understanding their frame. There's all these different terms, but they're the same thing. It's like we can't go in and start solving someone else's problems, and you're not solving problems in a complex system. But you can't even address what the problems might be if you don't really understand the larger system and appreciate what's happening. And so with that leader, why are they asking you to do design? Are you able to have those conversations? And the more conversations you're able to have, you're able to kind of set this up better. Just to continue, Paul started with the Field of Dreams reference, and if you build it, they'll come. This would be carrying into that. You have to ease their pain. The pain of that strategic sponsor is that they want some change, but they don't know what it's going to be. And they just know, well, you do this design thing, come bring it to us. But you have to be willing to go the distance I've worked the third one and I did it. You need to go the distance which means that you're not just going to do design from Monday to Friday with the planners waiting at the other end saying, gimme, 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 let's go do planning. This might be a much, much longer process of discovery, experimentation, risk, and prototype that could span far beyond what that leader was originally envisioning.
So this, Matthew, I just wonder if in the military's, situation where you have people that are really only in their jobs a couple of years, just the tempo of taking on a new job, you're faced with, what are my challenges? I got to knock down these targets in 18 months, 24 months, compared to what you just described as the civilian side where, you've got this depth of research. Does that impede, the military side? And we also, a lot of the team, the design team becomes a tasker, right? Here's a tasker, you're grabbing up these people, you come with your frame of reference and you're thrown in.
Yeah.
So you were talking about those two people that were just hard over resistant. I mean, in special forces, we talk about how, selection never ends, right? You just kind of continue to get assessed. And, at some point, removing those people, or if they're not the right people on a design team, you're not going to get a reasonable outcome. Whether they don't understand the depth or the breadth of the problem, or they, just are so fixated that, potentially
There's a lot of Paul again. There's a lot of institutional issues that I think are still yet to be figured out in this this design journey that the military is engaging in on a global basis, and I think how we teach it as well is an issue because we come in, we bring hard charging people come in for a week or two. Here at JSOU, it's the same up at CFC. The most time that people will spend is about 2 weeks doing something that you might go to for 4 years at a university to learn about and work for years on in a company in terms of a design project that you might be engaged there. And we're trying to get them up to speed because you only have 10, on a command and staff course, you've got 10 months and there's lots of things to learn. So our the very education that we use, I think, gives rise to problems about how easy this might be to do if for real, and set unrealistic expectations about what may be accomplished. So I think we really are at the beginning of a journey here. It's the promising start, but there's a long way to go yet until we're able to figure that out institutionally in terms of how it works at a command level, how it works within a planning team, and how we teach this to professionals so that they understand what it is they need to do and internalize it. And then it becomes comfortable, so that they don't want to say, you know what, I could have done this so much quicker if you just let me do MDMP.
Perhaps the leader with the appetite to do and set in motion a design or an activity or a vision that will take beyond their command to see even fruition. And not only would it be very difficult for them to set that in motion and be willing to do so, but also to convince their replacement to also participate. That's very, very difficult, I think, in the way our institution is configured right now. But it's something that our organization needs to think more about. And that maybe ties back into strategic sponsors and change agents looking at time and design and complexity beyond the current frame. To go the distance.
And I think there's examples of that in military history, with the development of air power, with the development of armored warfare concepts, with the development of maneuver warfare concepts, where you had, to use a phrase, a band of brothers who believed in a vision, who understood that this was a long-term process of building and creation, that no one person was going to ever be able to accomplish everything that was going to be necessary to do. But they had something to aim for and to work towards as a long-term team where they could pass it over in that trust that's so necessary. I'm going to trust you, Ben. I've taken it this far. I want you to continue moving this forward to that objective that we all know is where we need to be eventually.
Reminds me of what I heard your counterpart up there, Lee Bellio-Broussard, talk about when he was here at JSOU a year ago, talked about the importance of understanding the translation of the design deliverable over to a planning team, or understanding where does this thing need to go after the design team has crafted these new concepts, and what can we be doing to help usher it into its next journey, its next audience or its next iteration. But maybe that'll be a great topic for our next podcast.
Our next one. Well, on that note, I believe we're out of time. So I want to thank all of you for spending your time here to contribute to this podcast. And I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in. This has been the Joint Special Operations University's Soft Design and Innovation series of podcasts on these various topics, with this one, of course, being on change agents and strategic sponsors and their role in organizational change. Thank you all very much.